So we'll do as yesterday, we'll bring our panel up for questions at the end of the session. So excellent talk, thank you. Our next speaker is Sarah Richardson. Dr. Richardson is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University. She is jointly appointed in the Department of the History Science and the Committee on Degrees and Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her research focuses on race and gender in biosciences and on the social dimensions of scientific knowledge. Dr. Richardson will speak on messages to women about epigenetics and childhood obesity. Dr. Richardson.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Somewhat different perspective from history and philosophy of science. I've been asked today to speak about how fetal origins research focuses on female reproductive bodies predominantly as a central site of epigenetic programming and of public health policy intervention, and to think about the implications for women of this rising discourse, with a particular emphasis on the implications for poor women of color and their children. If we do not attend to these issues, epigenetics can become another stigmatizing, determinist discourse that threatens women's reproductive autonomy and contributes to fat stigma and moral panic about the mothering practices of poor women of color. Now, epigenetics, the first point I want to emphasize is that it has a life well beyond the laboratory and the halls of the national academies. It has riveted the public, and it has been received, I would say, in a largely celebratory manner, characterized variously by mysticism, poetic wonder, hype, humor, and popular writing on epigenetics often, I think we can all agree, projects very nascent scientific findings into practical advice for everyday living. Now, epigenetics is poorly understood by the public, and it's generally been received in a way that really mirrors the genetic determinism of previous eras, as offering switches to turn on and turn off genes through simple lifestyle modifications. I've been following the trope of headlines that say, you can change your DNA, you can change your genes, which reminds us that there's a high degree of scientific illiteracy around both genetics and epigenetics as it enters the popular sphere. This discourse tends to convey a larger effect size and much greater confidence in the solidity of the science in humans than is reflected in the scientific literature. And I think the talks have been very well balanced over the last day or so on this. Part of this hype can be attributed, of course, to the ways in which maternal-fetal epigenetic science speaks to urgent public health priorities in the areas of infant mortality, early childhood development, and prevention of complex and resource-intensive public health problems such as obesity. So there's a great amount of hope that it can help address what have been intransigent problems. And this presents a rich translational context for attracting investment and interest in epigenetics research, and it allows it to circulate to much broader publics than other areas of science. Now, epigenetic programming, I also want to note, has this public resonance because it raises philosophically riveting questions of the possibility that one's own experiences and behaviors can amplify into future generations. This connects with folk notions of inheritance as patrilineal and matrilineal. And this intergenerational kind of claim has focused, I would say, largely on females. One reason for this is that the maternal body in fetal programming kinds of explanations is conceptualized as an adaptive environment for the growing infant who is receiving crucial developmental cues. And because this programming can imprint on the fetus's, if a female, own gametes, the effects of the maternal environment are, it is suggested, may be intergenerational, passed through the maternal line to grand offspring. Historically, this kind of formulation of public health risk is, on the one hand, rooted in long-standing concerns to improve society by reducing the number of problem people, by managing and controlling human reproduction, and in particular, by calling on mothers to raise sound and productive citizens. This was a movement that, of course, reached its heights in the eugenic era when, using the very new genetic science, public health officials urged that certain maternal bodies were so harmful to society that they should be called upon not to reproduce. And they were subject in the tens of thousands to forced sterilizations, and the effects of this were particularly harsh on women of color and had a legacy well into the 20th century, and some would say to today. Out of this episode came a new profound commitment to reproductive autonomy and a new humility about directing human choices through very new science. But on the other hand, there are some very new elements to this new discourse. The science of maternal-fetal epigenetic programming also converges with several major trends in 20th and 21st century science, gender, and culture. From an understanding of motherhood as instinctual, selfless, and intrinsically moral, to a notion of motherhood as an agential project of the self, in which the mother's interests are often perceived to be in tension with the child's. From a psychosocial model of human development to a genetic and neurological model of child development, and from a conception of birth as the moment of personhood and medical concern to a conception of conception and even preconception as the focal point of political interest and biomedical interventions in reproduction. Now, epigenetic studies of maternal effects, given this backdrop of history, raise vital social, ethical, and philosophical questions. Is there a potential for this new research to heighten public health surveillance of and restrictions on pregnant women and mothers through a molecular policing of their behavior? How might this new research participate in the often troubled history of notions of the supreme role of the mother in normal and pathological development? And what are the empirical and methodological implications of a research focus on maternal effects largely to the exclusion of the larger social environment and, of course, of paternal effects? In the case of claims of obesity, we can add to these concerns a worry about replicating harmful stereotypes and misconceptions that contribute to stigma about fat children, which in itself can harm their mental and physical health and imperil their safety. We look at childhood bullying issues, for example. The notion that a fat child is something to mourn and to avoid at all costs is something that is reflected in images known as headless fatties, which I will note, seen on a few slides at this meeting, which suggests that fat is such a horrific thing that a mother and child would experience shame if we showed their faces. And critics have pointed out the profoundly dehumanizing effects of such images. Countering this is a growing and important critique of the use of the language of health and science and the concept of an obesity epidemic to tag certain bodies as a threat to the nation in ways that are often laced with the language of moral panic. Fat activists and their allies are not always looking to science and medicine for help and hope, but in fact are wary increasingly of its use of health to control and limit their autonomy and contribute to fat stigma. Their view is that a world in which all bodies are accepted is the ideal one for fat people, and they wish to have maximal autonomy to live their lives as they wish. Problematic considerations of race and class do not just occur in the popular communications of the science. Here's one example from Jonathan Wells at University College London. He's an influential theorist of early developmental programming in the prenatal maternal environment and has been very interested in the prenatal development of metabolic disorders and obesity as somatic manifestations of the intergenerational transmission of health inequalities. Wells mobilizes fetal origins theory to model how features of the mother's social and environmental context during her own development, including social class, may be transmitted to the growing fetus, conditioning it, he says, for a life of inequality even before birth. According to Wells, the maternal body serves as a transducing medium for health inequalities from one generation to another. Maternal capital, as he terms it, is corporealized in the maternal-fetal relation. This diagram of Wells's maternal capital model schematically illustrates Wells's conception of how public health policies, including education and healthcare, may be transmitted through the so-called somatic capital of the mother to offspring. Now, Wells has quite provocatively used the term metabolic ghetto to refer to these spaces of disadvantage within the mother's body, and argued that public health policies must therefore target multiple interventions through the maternal medium. In the obesity literature, there's a huge heterogeneity in discourse used. And some of the literature has indeed replicated this focus on mothers as both the agential causes of undesirable outcomes and the point of intervention. But it extends not just to mothers, but in the conceptual framing of the field to all women, even beginning at birth. So the total developmental period of mothers as a point of target. Here are quotes from Wells, but also Chris Kuzawa, suggesting that public health interventions may be most effective if focused not on the individual, but on the matriline. In these explanations, you often have discursively a representation of great responsibility combined with little agency. I call this the urgent, nonspecific, expansive intervention model. And this is just some hyped language that you do see in the literature, talking about a feed-forward cycle of maternal to offspring obesity transfer to address the obesity pandemic, the need for addressing the risk of obesity before females even enter the childbearing years, and even the suggestion of interventions during pregnancy. I've argued in some of my writing on maternal-fetal epigenetics that in this research, the maternal body emerges as an epigenetic vector, an intensified space for the introduction of epigenetic perturbations in development. I'd like to discuss some of the ways in which, on balance, you see this being mobilized in public discourse around these findings. The first point is that we have what I would call a deficit model. That is, this research principally advances or is seen as advancing a model of epigenetic modifications as a source of error, adverse effects, or disease risk. So while scientists, of course, acknowledge that epigenetics may provide a route to human enhancement or therapy, the main body of work at this time and the central object of concern is how to prevent the adverse effects of impaired or maladaptive maternal environments that are seen as causing epigenetic lesions in human lineages. Second, maternal bodies are regarded as the central targets of epigenetics-based health intervention. So graphically on the slides, time and time again, we see a mother's body at the center of a causal scheme or a scheme of intervention. So public health policies are proposed to be developed to aid the accumulation of somatic capital, for example, in women by targeting interventions at women. Public health interventions are seen as being most effective if targeted at women in this area. So, and again, note that what counts as a maternal body in this literature is potentially quite large and includes all premenopausal women, including young girls, as I noted before. The point has been made time and time again at this meeting of the neglect of paternal effects. Males, of course, provide paternal care in many species, and male gametes, as one talk yesterday noted, are also subject to environmental exposures and may carry critical developmental cues to future generations. And it is good to see that paternal effects are increasingly recognized by scientists, and there exist several studies substantiating the existence of intergenerational effects in mammalian paternal lines. However, I think it's fair to say, and it is reflected in the body of work discussed in this meeting, that there is an overwhelming focus on maternal effects in this literature. I'm just using as a way of getting into the issue this highly cited 2010 review article by Zhang and Meany, which as a simple metric uses the term maternal or mother 137 times, the terms parental or parent 11 times, and the terms paternal or father even only 3 times. Now, you can defend this imbalance, arguing that maternal phenotype has a greater capacity to shape offspring phenotype, though I think as we see, this is largely a working assumption rather than something that's been fully validated. But I also would, as a cultural studies scholar and historian, point to the fact that despite evidence that paternal behaviors and life experience, such as alcohol use, smoking, pesticide exposure, can impact the health of offspring from conception, It's true over time and historically that public health interventions about fetal harm have consistently focused on the mother and minimized paternal effects. And I think this pattern does, and so far, endure in this research. And this asymmetry, we can say, originates in long-standing Western cultural and ideological convictions that include, on the one hand, a belief in the greater vulnerability of female rather than male bodies, and also a belief in the primary responsibility of the mother for child development and resistance to notions of male reproductive vulnerability and to paternal responsibility for the development of embryos and infants. Third, while the target of intervention is the maternal body, the desired outcome of epigenetics-driven health interventions is usually improved fetal health. Researchers, of course, do hope that a collateral effect of their policies will be to enhance resources for pregnant women. However, most proposed interventions are directed toward the most efficient methods to ensure developmentally optimum outcomes for the fetus. And I think the symbols favored by some of the major texts and societies on the insignia of the International Society for DOHAD or on the cover of one of the field's leading textbooks represent this. Once again, we have our phenomenon of headless individuals, fetuses encapsulated in headless, legless maternal abdomens. The maternal body in this discourse is a transducing and amplifying medium necessary to get to the fetus, an obligatory passage point, not a primary endpoint or subject of the research. Finally, while maternal bodies are conceptualized in this literature, and I think this is really quite an interesting point, as having great power to influence future generations and are positioned at the center of the intervention model advanced by many in this field. In fact, the model accords individual women very little power to influence their own outcomes. It's an interesting feature of these kinds of feed-forward or mismatch models. So while women are instructed to do all they can to prevent harm to their fetus, at the same time, with the epigenetic feed-forward cycle hypothesized by maternal-fetal effects research, adverse effects originate in a misalignment between a fetus's inertial epigenetic programming and her eventual environment. So if the system has this kind of inertial quality where short-term investments may not lead to long-term benefits, this inertial system beyond conscious or individual control, where change manifests at the level of intergenerational lineage rather than the individual female, actually advances a shifting and mixed message regarding maternal agency and responsibility. It exhorts mothers to make changes that are unlikely to bring them or their offspring benefit. At the same time, it produces a model of the maternal body that suggests that maternal experiences, exposures, and behaviors may have very significant amplified consequences for her offspring, her descendants, and society at large. So just to wrap up, epigenetic research on maternal effects, I've argued, advances a model of human inheritance. And I don't know why that slide isn't coming up, but it shows a woman with a developing individual emerging from her abdomen. It advances this model of human inheritance and development in which the wider social and physical environment can be seen as heritable and as a determinant of future biomedical outcomes via discrete biochemical modifications introduced by the amplifying vector of the maternal body. And I would note in closing that while the great hope is that this literature would move us away from forms of deterministic explanations, in fact, the language strongly resembles that of genetic determinism. The multivalence concept of a vector points to a causal mechanistic explanatory landscape in which genes remain very much at the center. Environments, nutrition, toxins, social policy, and stress are collapsed into molecular mechanisms acting at the level of the DNA. It is genes, ultimately, that are expressed and regulated by these epigenetic mechanisms and that create the phenotypic outcomes of concern. All right, so I see that the light, I have 2 minutes? Okay, so then I'll continue. Rather than challenging genetic determinism and biological reductionism, then it's possible that present-day research programs in human epigenetics can strategically appropriate and modify these discourses to produce a new form of determinism, a somatic determinism or an epigenetic determinism, one that places the maternal-infant relation at the center. In closing, I'll just draw attention to this recent comment included in the reading literature for this field, which I did with Matt Gilman and others, in which we highlighted some of these issues and offered, we hope, some concrete suggestions for the translation of this research into the public sphere in ways that are non-stigmatizing and appropriately clarify the state of the science at this time. We offer 4 recommendations, and we give examples throughout the piece of why this is important. I'm happy to note, and I've been observing throughout the meeting, that many of these issues have been very conscientiously attended to. What happens often when we move into translation is that there's an impulse to simplify in order to quickly move findings into the public sphere, and many of these things drop out of sight, like making sure to clarify the differences between the animal experimental systems and the data that we have in humans, like emphasizing the role of both paternal and maternal effects, like conveying complexity, that these effects are small effect sizes that interact with many still poorly understood factors. And finally, recognizing that the direction that these findings can go that would be best for everyone involved and address the issues of stigma is to focus on societal level changes rather than instructions to individuals to change their behavior under conditions of structural inequality. Thank you.